Tin Basin is one of the most isolated and unforgiving places on Earth. It has all the conditions that force it to remain dry for tens of millions of years, even permanently. When the land can no longer retain water, life disappears, and infrastructure has no chance to survive. That is why a strange man in China decided to do the opposite of natural law. He ordered water channels to be cut through the sand, built a water distribution network like veins, and created a green belt stretching more than 550 kilometers across the desert. After these successes, they are preparing an even larger mega-project. But it is facing serious challenges because it could change the entire water map of Asia. All right, let us begin this story. You will be surprised at every part. Imagine a land covering nearly 340,000 square kilometers, larger than Germany itself. That is the Taklamakan, also known as the Tarim Basin, located at the crossroads of China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. When you look at a map, it appears like a gigantic bowl locked shut on all sides, with no opening for moist winds or seawater to enter, only sand, rock, and heat. And you may find yourself asking, why is this place so isolated that it sits almost outside Earth's biosphere? Turn back time, more than 50 million years, when the Indian tectonic plate slammed directly into the Eurasian plate, with enough force to lift the Tibetan Plateau to over 4,000 meters. That collision did not only create the Himalayas, it also raised massive stone walls around the Tarim Basin, the Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun Mountains to the south, and the Pamir Mountains to the west. Moist ocean winds were blocked. Rain could not reach the basin, and this land was effectively sealed off from normal climate systems. For tens of millions of years, everything washed down from the mountains. Dust, sand, clay, and salt was trapped here. The sediment layers beneath grew several kilometers thick, like stacking multiple Mount Everests laid flat on their sides. But the Taklamakan was not always dead. Along the edges of the basin, the Tarim region once formed a network of oases on the Silk Road. City-states such as Lulan and Nia once thrived, then vanished, not because of war, but because water changed its course. When the rivers withdrew, just a few generations later, sand swallowed entire settlements. Life for people living on the edge of the Taklamakan today is still extremely harsh. Sand dunes rise 200 to 300 meters high, equivalent to 70 to 100-story buildings, and they are constantly on the move. In summer, surface temperatures on the sand can reach 70 degrees Celsius. In winter, nighttime temperatures can drop below -20 degrees Celsius. Why is the difference so extreme? Because the air here is incredibly dry, with almost no clouds or moisture to retain heat. During the day, sand absorbs heat very quickly, and at night, it releases that heat just as fast, like standing on a metal plate, left in the sun, and then throwing it into a freezer. Then there is the wind. It does not just blow, it buries. Sandstorms arrive in cycles. Metal surfaces are worn down like sandpaper, and some structures are completely buried after just one night, making long-term survival nearly impossible. Humans can live here if forced to, but the land itself has never truly accepted them. You might think the influence of the Tarim Basin ends here, but it does not. Dust from this basin can travel thousands of kilometers, settling on snow in the Himalayas, crossing the Pacific Ocean, and even being detected in ice cores in Greenland. Yes, a distance of nearly 8,000 kilometers. Yes, if the Taklamakan continues to creep beyond the edge of the Tarim Basin, the consequences will not stop at China's borders. Dust will grow thicker, sandstorms will become more frequent, snow on high mountain ranges will melt faster, and that chain reaction will eventually have a direct impact on water resources, agriculture, and the climate of the entire Asian continent. That is why China no longer has the option to stand aside. It is forced to find a way to stop the desert. But in truth, there is an even bigger reason, buried deep beneath the sand. The Tarim Basin is one of China's largest oil and gas basins, home to major oil fields, natural gas reserves, compression stations, and hundreds of kilometers of pipelines running straight through the desert. Do you remember the location of this basin? It sits between China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, acting as a critical link that carries energy from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan deep into China's interior. Just imagine this. If even a few dozen kilometers of pipeline were repeatedly buried by sand, how many times higher would maintenance and operating costs become? And Tarim plays another role that is rarely discussed. It is a key node of the Belt and Road Corridor, where transportation, logistics, and even military supply routes are forced to pass through some of the country's harshest yet most strategic terrain. That is why the idea formed here is not simply, Let us plant a few more trees and see what happens. China did not choose a passive approach to adapting to the desert. This is not a single, isolated project. It is a plan stretching across many decades, where water, land, population, transportation, energy, and infrastructure are all calculated together at the same time. The core of this plan of systematic intervention was given a very straightforward name: the Tarim River Ecological Regulation Project. And at the center of the entire story is the Tarim River, the longest inland river in China, stretching roughly 1,300 kilometers. The Tarim does not flow into the sea. It is born from snow and ice in the Tian Shan Mountains, gathers water from multiple tributaries, and then simply ends in the desert. Do you know what that means? It means that every change, every mistake in water management, has nowhere to escape. Salt accumulates, the soil slowly dies. The ecosystem cannot recover on its own. The Tarim has always been an unpredictable river. It shifts its course, shrinks, and leaves behind wide strips of land bleached white with salt. But the hardest blow came during the period from 1960 to 1990, when Tarim's water was heavily diverted for cotton farming and agricultural irrigation. The consequences were unmistakable. More than 300 kilometers of the lower river dried up completely. The terminal lake, Taitema, disappeared. Groundwater levels dropped sharply, and vast numbers of Euphrates poplar trees died standing in the sand. So why did China choose the Tarim instead of another river? The answer is strategic. The Tarim runs along the edge of the Taklamakan, where sand is easier to stabilize because of the transitional terrain. If a river cutting straight into the heart of the desert were chosen, the water would simply sink into deep sand layers, producing almost no effect. Put plainly, the Tarim was not the optimal choice. It was the only viable choice left. Starting in the year 2000, China officially launched the project. As mentioned earlier, the first thing that must be made clear is this. This is not mass tree planting just to make satellite maps look greener. It is also not large-scale flooding in the sense of pour in as much water as possible. In fact, China had already tried those approaches elsewhere and failed. Overwatering in a salty environment only causes plant roots to rot faster. Releasing water at the wrong time simply makes it evaporate more quickly. The method, therefore, began with a step that sounds very simple, but in reality is extremely risky. Cutting canals through the desert. A series of straight, long canals were dug parallel to the Tarim River. Some stretch 20 to 40 kilometers, others only a few kilometers, and from there they branch into hundreds of smaller channels. Seen from satellite imagery, the entire system looks like an artificial circulatory network. The main canals act as arteries, the branch canals as capillaries, and the smallest channels deliver water to lands that have lost their moisture. But this system is far from stable. The Taklamakan does not stand still. Seasonal winds can reach speeds of 60 to 70 kilometers per hour, carrying fine sand that pours into the canals every day. Without dredging for just a few weeks, a canal section can be filled by 30 to 50% of its cross-section. Some branch canals are almost completely buried after just one season of strong winds. As a result, dredging work must be repeated every year, and in vulnerable sections, even multiple times within a single year. If you look closely, the key point is not the canals themselves, but how the water is used. In the Tarim region, water is not treated as a flood, but as medicine. And medicine must be given in the correct dose. Water is released in cycles, with volume and timing calculated in advance. If released too early, as much as 60 to 70% evaporates before it can soak in. If released too late, the soil has already dried down to depths of 8 to 10 meters, beyond the reach of plant roots. If released in excess, salt is drawn back up into the root zone, killing plants from below within just a few seasons. Imagine an ecosystem where being off by a few weeks, or even a few days, can destroy the results accumulated over 10 years. From the year 2000 until today, more than 20 major ecological water releases have been carried out along the Tarim River. Each release lasted between 2 and 4 weeks, with the total cumulative water volume estimated at nearly 100 cubic kilometers. Before every release, technical teams must measure soil salinity, groundwater levels, monitor air temperature, wind speed, and evaporation rates in each area. This is not a matter of opening the valve and waiting for results. Every release is a decision that cannot afford a mistake. The initial results show clear changes. In many areas along the Tarim, groundwater levels have risen again by about 1.8 to 3 meters, compared with the driest period of the 1990s. The land is no longer absolutely dead soil, but has shifted into a state of possibility. Plant roots no longer die immediately. Vegetation retains moisture for longer periods. Sand dunes begin to move more slowly. It may sound small, but in the desert, simply slowing the sand is already the line between survival and being buried. This project sounds impressive, does it not? Behind the entire philosophy of water control in the Tarim region stands one very important name, Wang Shucheng. He is a former Minister of Water Resources of China. He was not the first person to recognize the problems of the Tarim, but he was the one who asked the most fundamental question again. Should water be waited for passively, or must it be actively managed to save an ecosystem? Before Wang Shucheng, the common approach not only in China but in many countries was to build dams, store water, and then release it when needed. But reality showed that this method left behind serious consequences. Dams were built, yet downstream ecosystems were not restored. The soil became saline, trees died in large numbers. Water came and went, but life did not return. Wang Shucheng pointed out a hard truth that many found difficult to accept. Excess water can kill an ecosystem just as effectively as a lack of water. If water arrives too quickly, the soil cannot absorb it in time. If it arrives in the wrong season, plant roots are not active. If water is supplied continuously, salt in the soil is drawn upward, destroying soil structure from below. From this understanding, he pushed an important shift, moving away from the mindset of building massive structures toward managing water cycles. Under Wang Shucheng's leadership, projects along the Tarim River began to operate in a completely different way. There was no longer a single large release of water followed by waiting for results. Instead, water was released in measured doses, in intermittent cycles, and with receiving areas rotated in turn. This approach may sound harsh, but it was the only way to prevent ecosystems from being overwhelmed by water and then collapsing from the inside. When water began to return in the right way, something extremely important happened. The sand started to become heavier. It sounds simple, but in the desert, this is the line between dead land and land with hope. And the central character of this turning point was not humans, but a very special tree species, Populus euphratica, also known as the Euphrates poplar. This tree is unlike ordinary cultivated plants. It is extremely salt-tolerant. Its roots can grow 10 to 20 meters deep, and it can survive in brackish water, something most other plants cannot endure. But more importantly, Populus euphratica can only survive when the groundwater level stays within a very narrow window. If the water table is too low, the tree dies. If it is too high, the tree also dies. Because of this, in Chinese environmental science, the life or death of this species is used as a living ecological clock. Just by observing the condition of poplar forests, scientists can immediately tell where the groundwater level stands. When ecological water releases began to stabilize, the first poplar trees stopped dying upright. Their canopies grew denser, their trunks thicker, and most importantly, their roots began to hold the soil in place. But poplars do not work alone. At the same time came tamarisk, a shrub capable of drawing salt up into its leaves, which later fall away, gradually reducing soil salinity. And deeper in the sand is haloxylon, also known as saxol, a plant with powerful horizontal root systems that specialize in locking down moving sand dunes. Together, these three plant species form a simple but highly effective biological system. When soil retains moisture, sand no longer lifts easily into the air. When roots take hold, wind encounters resistance for the first time. Sand dunes hundreds of meters high begin to slow down. They do not stop completely, but they no longer creep forward as they once did. And when vegetation returns, animals do not wait long. Antelopes appear first, followed by foxes, birds, and smaller species, not because humans release them, but because the environment once again allows life. The desert does not disappear, but it stops advancing. The clearest evidence of all this lies at Taitama Lake, the terminal lake of the Tarim River. By the end of the 20th century, this lake had completely dried up. What was once open water became salt flats, then a source of fine dust. Every gust of wind turned into a small dust storm. But after the ecological water transfers, something few dared to be certain of actually happened. Water returned, not a vast lake, but patches of water sufficient for water birds to come back. And once water reappeared on the surface, local dust storms declined noticeably. But the story is not all green. The largest downside of the Tarim project is something scientists openly call a locked ecosystem. Once vegetation has been established in the desert, water supply cannot be stopped. If the flow is cut, even for just a few seasons, the vegetation will die faster than if it had never existed at all. The green desert here is not an independent natural system, but one that depends almost entirely on human control. Because of this, water use for the Tarim has sparked controversy even within China itself, because prioritizing water for the desert over people has never been a matter of full consensus. The project is located in Xinjiang, where water resources are already scarce. For upstream farmers, especially in cotton and wheat growing regions, this issue is far from abstract. Less water means lower yields and more unstable incomes. There have been periods of serious tension when farmers protested the decision to reserve water for ecological use while their fields lacked irrigation. At certain points, local courts were forced to intervene to mediate water rights between different parties. This is a very real conflict between ecological protection and food security, and it shows that the Tarim project is not a one-sided story of the state decides and it happens. However, it is precisely this sharp conflict that has brought greater attention to the Tarim Basin. China does not treat it merely as an effort to save a single river basin, but as a real-world test of how humans can intervene in large-scale arid ecosystems. Tarim forces decision-makers to confront multiple limits at the same time: limited water, saline soils, strong winds, ecological demands, and livelihood needs. No single factor can be optimized without paying a price in another. Current anti-desertification projects in the Gobi Desert and Inner Mongolia are directly based on lessons learned from Tarim, because they face the same fundamental challenge: scarce water, powerful winds, soils prone to salinization, and population pressure that does not allow for prolonged mistakes. But this very reality also exposes the greatest limitation of the entire system: water remains extremely scarce. Every ecological water release is not a simple decision, but a full-scale technical operation. Seasonal evaporation rates must be calculated. Releases must avoid overlapping with flood seasons to prevent erosion. Water rights must be negotiated among agriculture, ecology, and infrastructure. Every cubic meter of water has an owner, and redirecting it always comes with trade-offs. It was in this context that a question began to appear more and more often among Chinese planners. What if the Tarim had a stable, long-term water source, not periodic releases, but a source that already exists, one that does not rely entirely on snowmelt or seasonal regulation? In the year 2015, that question led to a startling discovery. Scientists confirmed that beneath the Taklamakan Desert lies a massive underground aquifer. But hope was quickly tempered by a cold reality. This water is saline, rich in minerals, extremely deep, and extracting it is almost economically unfeasible. Turning it into usable water would require energy costs comparable to, or even higher than, seawater desalination. However, the true value of this discovery does not lie in supplying water. What exists beneath the Taklamakan is not a drought rescue reserve, but a vast geological storage system. These saline groundwater layers act as living climate records, preserving tens of thousands of years of environmental history. More importantly, they function as a natural carbon lock, trapping dissolved carbon within soils and surface waters for hundreds, even thousands of years. In other words, beneath a desert that appears useless lies a long-term memory of the Earth itself. It does not save the Tarim from thirst, but it reveals that this region is not only about water, but also about the carbon cycle and the global climate. When every solution within reach proved insufficient, a more extreme idea began to surface in China's strategic discussions. It has an unofficial but easy-to-remember name: the Red Flag River. This is not a regional regulation project like the Tarim, nor an expansion of a few existing canals. The Red Flag River is a proposal for a continental-scale water transfer, drawing its source from the Tibetan Plateau, also known as the Water Tower of Asia. This region alone feeds more than 10 major rivers and supports the lives of roughly 1.5 to 2 billion people downstream. The idea is straightforward, even cold in its logic. If the arid basins of northern and northwestern China no longer have enough water, then water must be brought in from where it exists in the greatest abundance. The scale of the Red Flag River goes far beyond any previous project. Preliminary proposals speak of thousands of kilometers of canals and tunnels, crossing terrain at elevations of 3,000 to 5,000 meters, cutting through active geological fault zones, permafrost, and regions where construction is feasible for only a few months each year. The volume of water discussed in these scenarios ranges around 50 to 60 cubic kilometers per year, equivalent to the entire domestic water demand of a medium-sized country. Initial cost estimates place the project at approximately 260 billion United States dollars. However, many independent analyses suggest the real figure could be significantly higher once long-term operating costs, maintenance under extreme conditions, and geological risks are fully accounted for. However, even while the Red Flag River remains only on paper, the geopolitical challenges and downstream risks are already very clear. First is the climate factor. Central Asia is among the regions warming faster than the global average, with temperature increases about 1.5 to 2 times higher than the world average. Even more concerning, meltwater from snow and ice in the Tian Shan Mountains, the most critical water source for the Tarim, is approaching its peak and is expected to decline in the future. In other words, the entire Tarim system is not operating under stable conditions, but within a context that is becoming increasingly unfavorable over time. With each passing year, the same management model must shoulder greater risks, and those risks do not stop at China's borders. Once the discussion shifts to larger water sources, the issue immediately takes on a geopolitical dimension. The Tibetan Plateau is the source of many rivers vital to Asia, including the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and the Indus. These rivers are not just water. They represent agriculture, food supplies, and livelihoods for hundreds of millions, even billions of people downstream. For India and Bangladesh, any change upstream could disrupt flood seasons, dry seasons, and food security. For Southeast Asian countries, especially within the Mekong Basin, the concerns are even more concrete. Disrupted fish migration, reduced sediment flow, declining fisheries yields, and the resulting economic and social consequences. A shift of only a few % in river flow can throw downstream ecosystems completely out of balance. Even on the Tibetan Plateau itself, ecological risks are significant. When river flows are altered, grasslands dry out more quickly, and wildlife that depends on grasses and streams begins to decline. The soils in this region are naturally thin and fragile, making erosion accelerate once stable moisture is lost. A small hydrological change can trigger a chain of ecological degradation that is difficult to reverse, especially under rapidly warming climate conditions. For these reasons, the Red Flag River has not yet been approved. But China does not give up easily. It has continued to push forward projects in the Tarim region, and Boston Lake is a clear example. This is the largest freshwater lake in Xinjiang, with an area that once exceeded 1,000 square kilometers. However, for many decades, the lake suffered severe decline due to 3 main causes: excessive water withdrawal for irrigation, pollution from agriculture and industry, and the disruption of natural inflow channels. From the 1990s to the early 2000s, the lake's water level fell continuously, at times dropping more than 2 meters below its historical level. Salinity rose rapidly, vast areas of lakeside reeds disappeared, and many fish species declined sharply or vanished altogether. At one point, Boston Lake had almost lost its ecological function and served only as a reservoir of poor quality water. In the early 2010s, authorities launched a restoration program. The first step was to halt water withdrawals that exceeded ecological thresholds. Dozens of polluted inflow canals were shut down. Water level control structures were built to regulate inflow and outflow, preventing salt accumulation in the lake. At the same time, conservation measures were introduced. Fishing bans during the breeding season, lasting about 3 to 4 months each year, the release of millions of juvenile fish, and the restoration of tens of thousands of hectares of lakeside reeds, an important biological buffer that filters water and stabilizes shorelines. Results did not appear immediately, but after several years, the lake's water level became more stable and salinity dropped noticeably. Fish returned, and migratory waterbirds appeared seasonally. Boston Lake did not simply regain water. It began to function as a relatively stable ecosystem. Controlled fishing resumed, yields gradually increased, and ecotourism started to develop. This case shows that environmental protection and economic use can coexist if management is strict enough. At the same time, China addressed another equally critical issue: transportation in Xinjiang. The northern and southern parts of the region are separated by the Tian Shan Mountains. In the past, crossing the range took 3 to 5 hours, and winter travel was frequently disrupted by heavy snow, ice, and rockfalls. This slowed freight transport and drove logistics costs sharply higher. The solution chosen was to bore tunnels through the mountains. The project consists of 2 main tunnel tubes and 1 service tunnel, stretching more than 20 kilometers, running deep beneath permafrost zones and through multiple active geological fault belts. Construction took place under low temperatures, high rock pressure, and significant risk, but the objective was clear: shorten travel time and ensure year-round connectivity. Once completed, crossing the Tian Shan was reduced from several hours to roughly 20 to 30 minutes. Northern and southern Xinjiang became far more reliably connected. Freight transport improved, costs fell, and strategic infrastructure no longer depended entirely on extreme weather conditions. In the end, Tarim is no longer a story about planting trees or fighting desertification. It is the moment when humans began to treat water like an operating system. So what do you think? Is Tarim a technical miracle that should be replicated, or an intervention that goes too far, a risky draft of the future? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to read everyone's perspective. And if you enjoy stories about geography, water, power, and the hidden costs of mega projects, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss our documentaries. At present, the Gaza Strip remains under a complete blockade. The war has never truly stopped. Neighborhoods that were once crowded are now nothing but piles of rubble, and hospitals are operating under conditions of power shortages, water shortages, and shortages of almost everything. More than 2 million people have been forced into a narrow strip of land measuring just over 360 square kilometers. Yet something extraordinary may soon happen here, because a massive construction project is quietly underway. Excavators, steel pipes, and heavy machinery operate day and night, digging through the desert near the border. Deep trenches gradually take shape, and in satellite images, a long and unusual line begins to appear. This project was never officially announced or launched in front of the media, but local residents know about it. They can feel it, and for the first time in a very long while, they dare to hope. What is this project? And does it truly have the power to change Gaza's fate? Today's story begins right there. The Gaza Strip lies along the Mediterranean coast, stretching more than 40 kilometers in length but extremely narrow, with the narrowest point only a few kilometers wide. Looking at a map, you can clearly see that Gaza has the sea right in front of it. But in reality, there are no rivers, no lakes, and almost no natural surface water sources. The entire life of more than 2 million people here depends on something invisible beneath the ground: the coastal aquifer. For many decades, 98% of Gaza's domestic water supply has been pumped directly from this aquifer. People drill wells for drinking, cooking, bathing, and irrigation. The problem is that this aquifer is far too small and too shallow for the current population density. It is being exploited at nearly 3 times its natural recharge rate. When groundwater is overpumped, seawater from the Mediterranean Sea intrudes into the ground, making the water increasingly salty. Untreated wastewater and agricultural fertilizers seep downward, pushing nitrate levels far beyond safe limits. Before the year 2023, international reports had already confirmed that about 97% of Gaza's water was not safe for direct drinking. In other words, Gaza entered the war with a water system that was already close to irreversible collapse. After the year 2023, the situation became far more severe. When the war arrived, more than 80% of the water infrastructure was destroyed. Pumping stations stopped operating, main pipelines were shattered, and water treatment facilities were damaged or disabled. Electricity was cut off, fuel could not enter, and this caused the remaining small-scale desalination plants to shut down. Many wells were completely destroyed, while others were located in areas that civilians could not access due to ongoing fighting. The remaining groundwater became contaminated by sewage and massive amounts of debris. In many areas, each person is left with only 3 to 5 liters of water per day, and even that water is not entirely clean. Think about it for a moment. How much is 3 to 5 liters? 1 large bottle of water to drink, cook, wash hands, and maintain basic hygiene for an entire day. Meanwhile, the United Nations Emergency Survival Standard is about 15 to 20 liters per person per day. Gaza is surviving on less than 1/3 of that minimum level. Water scarcity does not only mean thirst. It means not being able to wash hands regularly, not being able to clean wounds, and not being able to manage waste. In overcrowded shelters, this creates ideal conditions for outbreaks of acute diarrhea, hepatitis A, typhoid fever, and skin diseases. According to warnings from international health agencies, acute diarrhea can become fatal very quickly for children and the elderly if rehydration and treatment are not provided in time. Hepatitis A spreads through contaminated water and food, thrives in poor sanitation conditions, and can lead to acute liver failure, especially dangerous for people suffering from malnutrition. Humanitarian reports indicate that within a short period of time, hundreds of thousands of acute diarrhea cases were recorded in Gaza. Hepatitis A also surged as clean water and sewage systems collapsed. And do not forget that most hospitals have been destroyed or are barely functioning, lacking electricity, medicine, and even clean water for sterilization. When war and water shortages continue for so long, it is not difficult to understand why so many people are forced to abandon their homes. However, by the month of July, from the Egyptian side, convoys of excavators, pipelines, and heavy pumping equipment crossed the border. There was no groundbreaking ceremony, no press conference, not a single official announcement to the public. The construction site operated 24 hours a day, under the desert sun during the daytime, and beneath industrial lights at night. Digging deep, very deep, deep enough for water to flow beneath the ground. Residents living near the border began to notice that something was unusual. They said they could hear low vibrations beneath the sand, as if something were moving underground. Like you right now, they began asking the same question. Who was digging? And what were they digging for? Later, some sources revealed that this activity was connected to Operation Chivalrous Night 3, a program described as humanitarian, intended to lay water pipelines and supply water to Gaza. But at that time, no one clearly stated the true scale of the project, and even fewer explained why it had to be carried out as a closed and highly secretive operation. But wait, we already said that Gaza has no rivers and no lakes, so where does this water come from? We also said the machinery came from the Egyptian side of the border, but the water is not taken from Egypt. Let us take a closer look at this country's situation. Egypt is one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. About 97% of the total freshwater supply for more than 110 million people depends on the Nile River. Without the Nile, Egypt would almost cease to exist. For many years, rapid population growth, hotter climate conditions, and exploding agricultural and urban demand have pushed Egypt to consume far more water than nature can naturally replenish. The situation becomes even more serious as Egypt faces the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile. The Egyptian government has repeatedly stated that even a reduction of about 5% in the Nile's flow would be enough to trigger a national disaster, directly affecting food security, electricity supply, and social stability. So how could a country that is already thirsty possibly spare fresh water for Gaza? The answer from most hydrology experts is no. So then, what is this water source? The answer lies in a detail that seems almost paradoxical: the sea. Gaza and the Rafah area sit directly along the Mediterranean coast, an endless source of water that cannot be consumed directly. For many years, arid countries in the Middle East have relied on seawater desalination technology to survive. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates all do this, and Gaza, in a state of desperation, has no other option. According to confirmed information, the water being brought into Gaza is desalinated seawater, processed at facilities located near the Mediterranean coastline in the Rafah area. Egypt does not supply the water itself, but instead serves as a geographic corridor, allowing pipelines and infrastructure to pass through its territory. So if the water does not come from Egypt, then who is capable of standing behind a desalination system, an independent pipeline, and continuous operation in the middle of a war? At the moment, there is likely only one answer: the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is one of the countries most dependent on desalinated water in the world. Today, more than 90% of its domestic water supply comes from desalination, and the country operates dozens of large and small plants along the Persian Gulf. The Jebel Ali and Tawila complexes alone supply millions of cubic meters of water every single day. That level of capacity allows the UAE to intervene in places where other countries, even if they wanted to, simply could not. In Gaza, the UAE did not choose the easiest option of pumping water from Egypt or connecting to Israel's existing network. Instead, it deployed a completely independent system. Seawater is taken directly from the Mediterranean Sea, desalinated in the Rafah area, and then delivered into Gaza through a closed pipeline. Egypt does not lose a single drop of fresh water, Israel does not control the flow, and Gaza's residents do not have to pay for it. This is the key factor that allows the project to exist in an extremely sensitive political environment. In official documents, this pipeline is referred to as the Lifeline Water Supply Project, quite literally a lifeline. In the month of August of the year 2025, Egypt publicly announced the name of the overall operation for the first time, Operation Chivalrous Night 3. The pipeline is tightly secured, built continuously, and operated as strategic infrastructure rather than an ordinary civilian project. According to humanitarian data that has been made public, under the framework of Chivalrous Night 3, the UAE did far more than just build a pipeline. At the same time, it repaired damaged water networks in northern Gaza, restored wells and reservoirs in southern Gaza, and maintained daily water truck deliveries to densely populated temporary shelters. 6 small-scale desalination facilities were constructed around Rafah, providing survival-level water supplies for hundreds of thousands of people, compared to the conditions that existed before. One Middle East water infrastructure expert once commented, "This is not a project that helps Gaza recover. It is a project that helps Gaza avoid total collapse." That remark accurately reflects the true nature of the operation. The UAE does not claim to solve Gaza's water crisis at its root. It is simply buying time, using water. This approach is not new for the UAE. In the past, it has implemented similar water and medical projects in Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia, where clean water has also been used as a tool for social stabilization before any political solutions are discussed. Gaza represents the most extreme case: extremely high population density, continuous warfare, and almost no domestic water sources at all. To understand what this project truly solves and what it does not solve, we need to begin with the technical core of the pipeline now running underground beneath the Gaza Strip. The first stage is the construction of an independent water pipeline. This is not a massive structure like a dam or an open canal, but a system designed for rapid deployment under wartime conditions. The pipeline is approximately 6 to 7.5 kilometers long, with a diameter of about 315 millimeters, roughly equivalent to a medium-sized urban water pipe. Its designed capacity reaches about 7,500 cubic meters per day, which is approximately 28 million liters of water per day. This number only becomes meaningful when placed in the context of Gaza, where many areas previously had only 3 to 5 liters per person per day, and in some places even less than 1 liter. This system connects directly to a desalination plant near Rafah, carries water through an intermediate reservoir, and then distributes it into the network in southern Gaza. The water does not pass through Israeli infrastructure, nor does it draw from Egypt's freshwater sources. It is a closed water circuit running from the sea to the final user, helping to bypass the political and technical bottlenecks that caused many previous projects to fail. You may also be wondering how many people this amount of water can support. Using the standard applied by humanitarian organizations in emergency situations, about 15 liters per person per day, this capacity could serve roughly 600,000 people. However, it is important to be very clear. 15 liters is not a normal living standard. It is only a minimum survival threshold, enough for drinking, basic cooking, and minimal hygiene. It is not sufficient for regular laundry, not enough for stable daily life, and certainly not enough for a city to function in any real sense. Alongside the completion of the pipeline, the operation was expanded in layered support phases. Technical teams began restoring old wells that had been shut down, while also drilling new wells, including artesian wells, which rely on natural pressure and reduce dependence on electric pumps. According to published information, by the month of May in the year 2025, the next phase of the operation had repaired 28 non-operational wells, helping improve access to water for approximately 700,000 people. At the same time, a large-scale logistics system was established outside Gaza to ensure that water was not the only form of aid being delivered. The core of this system was based in El Arish, where the UAE built 12 warehouses operating continuously. These warehouses store everything from baby diapers and blankets to dry food, medicines, and medical supplies, providing direct support to the areas receiving water. By the month of October, thousands of volunteers in the UAE joined the Compassion for Gaza campaign personally, packing aid during work shifts that lasted many hours. According to published figures, by the middle of the month of June in the year 2024, the total volume of aid sent from the UAE into Gaza had reached approximately 33,000 tons, transported by 320 flights, 7 sea vessels, and more than 200 trucks. This shows that the effort is not short-term, but a continuously maintained supply chain operating under complex wartime conditions. By the month of September in the year 2025, a new aid convoy consisting of 22 water tanker trucks and 5 ambulances entered Gaza, turning water delivery by tanker from an emergency solution into a regular operation, supplementing the pipeline and well systems. Looking at the project as a whole, its true nature becomes clear. The pipeline is only the backbone, while the ability to sustain life depends on a multi-layered aid ecosystem, ranging from desalination and wells to tanker trucks and logistics warehouses. It does not allow Gaza to fully recover, but in a context where infrastructure has already collapsed, it is enough to keep hundreds of thousands of people from falling below the line of survival. But let us pause for a moment and ask an honest question. If water were no longer provided for free but instead became a commodity that people had to pay for, what would happen? It may sound cold, but around the world, this situation is not rare at all. In principle, there are 2 ways to sell water. The first way is that people pay directly for every cubic meter of water they use, similar to paying an electricity bill. The second way is that the government purchases water in large quantities and then redistributes it to the population through taxes, subsidies, or service fees. Both models operate in the real world, not just on paper. Let us take a very easy-to-visualize example: the water pipeline from Turkey to northern Cyprus. This project was completed in the month of September in the year 2014 and was once considered the longest undersea water pipeline in the world. Before that, Cyprus repeatedly suffered from drought. Rainfall declined decade after decade, groundwater levels dropped sharply, and many areas were forced to ration water. Imagine turning on a tap without knowing whether water would flow that day. That was daily life for people there before the year 2014. The pipeline was designed for 50 years of operation, with a capacity of about 75 million cubic meters per year, equivalent to nearly 20 billion gallons. Half of the water is used for drinking and household needs, while the other half is used for agricultural irrigation. From a technical standpoint, this is a highly unusual project. The pipeline is made of special polymer plastic, suspended beneath the sea at depths of up to 250 meters, stretching nearly 80 kilometers in length, with a diameter of about 1.6 meters. The total cost was approximately 450 million United States dollars. Most importantly is how the water is sold. When the first water began flowing in the year 2015, the wholesale price was only about 2.3 lira per cubic meter. Local authorities then sold it to residents at a higher price, averaging 4 to 5 lira per cubic meter. This meant that water became a paid service, but it was still far cheaper than desalination. By the year 2022, prices increased due to inflation and rising energy costs. Yet both sides continued to view the project as beneficial. Turkey gained a stable source of revenue, while Cyprus escaped decades of chronic water scarcity. Another example, closer to everyday life in Asia, is the water supply pipeline to Kinmen from mainland China. Kinmen is a small island group with a dense population and very limited groundwater. Pumping groundwater was not sufficient, and building desalination plants was too expensive. In the end, they chose to buy water. Water is taken from Longhu Lake, routed through a coastal city and then pumped through an undersea pipeline approximately 18 kilometers long to Kinmen. This system has a maximum capacity of 55,000 tons per day and currently operates at around 34,000 tons per day. The water price is only about 10 new Taiwan dollars per cubic meter, which is less than 0.35 United States dollars, far cheaper than desalination. These two stories reveal a very clear common point. When water becomes a commodity, society must have money, a functioning and stable government, and the ability to pay consistently over many years. Now ask yourself honestly, does that exist in Gaza? In a place where the economy is paralyzed, infrastructure has been destroyed, and people are already living on the edge of severe water scarcity, can they really pay for water? Or would they be forced to pay with something else, something even more frightening? There is also another problem we need to consider. It does not lie in how much fresh water is produced, but in what is left behind. Concentrated brine waste. For every 1 cubic meter of fresh water produced, about 1.3 to 1.6 cubic meters of brine are generated, with salinity levels 2 to 3 times higher than natural seawater. Unlike household wastewater, brine is heavier than seawater. When it is discharged into the environment, it does not disperse quickly. Instead, it sinks to the seafloor, forming dense salinity layers that cling to the ocean bottom. In these zones, dissolved oxygen levels drop sharply, causing seagrass, invertebrates, fish eggs, and larvae to suffocate and die in large numbers. This risk becomes especially serious in the Mediterranean Sea. It is an almost enclosed body of water, where annual evaporation exceeds freshwater inflow, making it what scientists describe as a negative water balance ecosystem. Under such conditions, any additional salt has very limited pathways to escape. Recent synthesis studies show that global brine discharge is actually about 50% higher than previous estimates, largely because many desalination plants operate above their designed capacity or lack effective dilution systems. To grasp the scale of the problem, scientists once offered a shocking comparison. The total amount of brine discharged globally each year would be enough to cover the entire state of Florida with a layer of salty sludge about 30 centimeters thick. This figure comes from roughly 16,000 desalination plants currently in operation, producing nearly 9 trillion gallons of fresh water every year. In other words, every drop of fresh water we gain leaves behind a very specific environmental cost on the seafloor. What is even more concerning is that more than 55% of global brine discharge is concentrated in a very small region: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. These are also the same areas where independent studies have recorded abnormal increases in salinity in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Desalination, therefore, is shifting the water crisis from land into marine ecosystems, rather than eliminating it. When Gaza is placed into this picture, the risks become even more sensitive. Desalination plants are built right along the coastline, discharging brine during wartime conditions, with limited continuous environmental monitoring and no comprehensive biological observation networks. The practical questions are unavoidable. Who measures salinity levels every day? Who monitors benthic organisms? Who has the authority to shut down a plant if safety thresholds are exceeded? In an active conflict zone, those control mechanisms almost do not exist. And that is not all. Desalination is also an energy-intensive industry. On average, each cubic meter of water requires 3 to 4 kilowatt-hours of electricity, along with expensive chemicals and reverse osmosis membranes. When electricity is suddenly cut off, reverse osmosis membranes can be permanently damaged, turning a plant worth tens of millions of United States dollars into scrap metal. The reality in Gaza shows that many desalination plants were not destroyed by bombs, but slowly died due to prolonged power outages and the lack of replacement parts. You might think the dark side of this project stops at environmental damage, right? But there is another risk, far more direct and far more dangerous. First is the pure risk of war itself. Gaza is one of the most heavily bombed areas in the world in recent years. According to public statistics from the United Nations and conflict monitoring organizations, tens of thousands of infrastructure targets have been struck, including roads, bridges, power stations, and water systems. In that context, an underground pipeline that cannot be buried very deep due to geological conditions and emergency construction becomes an extremely fragile target. A large explosion does not even need to hit it directly. Shockwaves alone can crack pipes, break joints, or destroy pressure valves. What makes this especially dangerous is that water pipelines do not fail quietly. When they rupture, the consequences spread very quickly. A clear example is the incident in Karachi in the month of April in the year 2025. A major water supply pipeline with an extremely large diameter ruptured near a university campus. Within just a few hours, water flooded multiple streets, collapsed road surfaces, swept away vehicles, and caused serious damage to surrounding residential areas. Because shutoff valves were not closed in time, many districts of Karachi lost water completely, forcing authorities to urge residents to store water urgently. If a similar incident were to occur in Gaza, the volume of escaped water might be smaller than in Karachi, but the consequences would be no less severe. The pipeline runs close to roads and temporary shelters. If repairs are delayed even by a few hours, water could flood tents, contaminate the already scarce remaining water sources, and carry waste and filth along with it. In a place where people survive on only 15 liters of water per person per day, every cubic meter lost becomes a matter of life and death. Another example that shows how fragile strategic pipelines can be comes from Europe. In the year 2024, the Greek island of Aegina suddenly lost its main water supply due to a failure in an undersea pipeline. At first, authorities suspected sabotage and sent divers to inspect the line. Eventually, the cause was identified as a natural crack at a joint, but repairs took many days. During that time, the island was forced to pump temporary water from old wells. Daily life was disrupted, and tourism came to a halt. The future of Gaza's water project is not decided by whether the pipeline has been completed or not, but by a far more difficult question: who will maintain it while the war continues? Desalinated water is not something you can simply turn on and leave running. Behind every cubic meter of water flowing into Gaza is a continuous chain of costs, including electricity to operate the system, reverse osmosis membranes that must be replaced regularly, treatment chemicals, and technical teams on standby 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. According to water industry experts, operating and maintenance costs often account for more than half of the total cost over the lifetime of a desalination plant, which means that construction is only the first step. In a conflict zone, this fragile technical chain is more vulnerable than ever. A single sudden power outage can permanently damage filtration membranes. One shipment of spare parts blocked by a siege or fighting is enough to shut the entire system down. As a result, this project opens the door to a very fragile future. In the best-case scenario, if hostilities ease and infrastructure is protected, the pipeline and desalination plants could become a survival backbone for hundreds of thousands of people, helping Gaza endure its darkest period. But in a worse scenario, just a few broken technical links could paralyze the entire system, turning a life-saving project into a useless mass of steel in the desert. And will water in Gaza remain humanitarian aid forever, or will it one day become a commodity, or even a new instrument of power? This story has no ending yet, and it will only become clear as we continue to observe, ask questions, and debate. If you find that these analyses help you better understand what lies behind the brief headlines, leave a comment to share your perspective and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that come next. Tarim Basin is one of the most isolated and unforgiving places on Earth. It has all the conditions that force it to remain dry for tens of millions of years, even permanently. When the land can no longer retain water, life disappears, and infrastructure has no chance to survive. That is why a strange man in China decided to do the opposite of natural law. He ordered water channels to be cut through the sand, built a water distribution network like veins, and created a green belt stretching more than 550 kilometers across the desert. After these successes, they are preparing an even larger mega project. But it is facing serious challenges because it could change the entire water map of Asia. All right, let us begin this story. You will be surprised at every part. Imagine a land covering nearly 340,000 square kilometers, larger than Germany itself. That is the Taklamakan, also known as the Tarim Basin, located at the crossroads of China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. When you look at a map, it appears like a gigantic bowl locked shut on all sides, with no opening for moist winds or seawater to enter, only sand, rock, and heat. And you may find yourself asking, why is this place so isolated that it sits almost outside Earth's biosphere? Turn back time, more than 50 million years, when the Indian tectonic plate slammed directly into the Eurasian plate with enough force to lift the Tibetan plateau to over 4,000 meters. That collision did not only create the Himalayas, it also raised massive stone walls around the Tarim Basin, the Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun Mountains to the south, and the Pamir Mountains to the west. Moist ocean winds were blocked. Rain could not reach the basin, and this land was effectively sealed off from normal climate systems. For tens of millions of years, everything washed down from the mountains. Dust, sand, clay, and salt was trapped here. The sediment layers beneath grew several kilometers thick, like stacking multiple Mount Everests laid flat on their sides. But the Taklamakan was not always dead. Along the edges of the basin, the Tarim region once formed a network of oases on the Silk Road. City-states such as Lulan and Nia once thrived, then vanished, not because of war, but because water changed its course. When the rivers withdrew, just a few generations later, sand swallowed entire settlements. Life for people living on the edge of the Taklamakan today is still extremely harsh. Sand dunes rise 200 to 300 meters high, equivalent to 70 to 100-story buildings, and they are constantly on the move. In summer, surface temperatures on the sand can reach 70 degrees Celsius. In winter, nighttime temperatures can drop below -20 degrees Celsius. Why is the difference so extreme? Because the air here is incredibly dry, with almost no clouds or moisture to retain heat. During the day, sand absorbs heat very quickly, and at night, it releases that heat just as fast, like standing on a metal plate, left in the sun, and then throwing it into a freezer. Then there is the wind. It does not just blow, it buries. Sandstorms arrive in cycles. Metal surfaces are worn down like sandpaper, and some structures are completely buried after just one night, making long-term survival nearly impossible. Humans can live here if forced to, but the land itself has never truly accepted them. You might think the influence of the Tarim Basin ends here, but it does not. Dust from this basin can travel thousands of kilometers, settling on snow in the Himalayas, crossing the Pacific Ocean, and even being detected in ice cores in Greenland. Yes, a distance of nearly 8,000 kilometers. Yes, if the Taklamakan continues to creep beyond the edge of the Tarim Basin, the consequences will not stop at China's borders. Dust will grow thicker, sandstorms will become more frequent, snow on high mountain ranges will melt faster, and that chain reaction will eventually have a direct impact on water resources, agriculture, and the climate of the entire Asian continent. That is why China no longer has the option to stand aside. It is forced to find a way to stop the desert. But in truth, there is an even bigger reason, buried deep beneath the sand. The Tarim Basin is one of China's largest oil and gas basins, home to major oil fields, natural gas reserves, compression stations, and hundreds of kilometers of pipelines running straight through the desert. Do you remember the location of this basin? It sits between China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, acting as a critical link that carries energy from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan deep into China's interior. Just imagine this. If even a few dozen kilometers of pipeline were repeatedly buried by sand, how many times higher would maintenance and operating costs become? And Tarim plays another role that is rarely discussed. It is a key node of the Belt and Road Corridor, where transportation, logistics, and even military supply routes are forced to pass through some of the country's harshest yet most strategic terrain. That is why the idea formed here is not simply, let us plant a few more trees and see what happens. China did not choose a passive approach to adapting to the desert. This is not a single, isolated project. It is a plan stretching across many decades, where water, land, population, transportation, energy, and infrastructure are all calculated together at the same time. The core of this plan of systematic intervention was given a very straightforward name, the Tarim River Ecological Regulation Project, and at the center of the entire story is the Tarim River, the longest inland river in China, stretching roughly 1,300 kilometers. The Tarim does not flow into the sea. It is born from snow and ice in the Tian Shan Mountains, gathers water from multiple tributaries, and then simply ends in the desert. Do you know what that means? It means that every change, every mistake in water management, has nowhere to escape. Salt accumulates, the soil slowly dies. The ecosystem cannot recover on its own. The Tarim has always been an unpredictable river. It shifts its course, shrinks, and leaves behind wide strips of land bleached white with salt. But the hardest blow came during the period from 1960 to 1990, when Tarim's water was heavily diverted for cotton farming and agricultural irrigation. The consequences were unmistakable. More than 300 kilometers of the lower river dried up completely. The terminal lake, Taitema, disappeared. Groundwater levels dropped sharply, and vast numbers of Euphrates poplar trees died standing in the sand. So why did China choose the Tarim instead of another river? The answer is strategic. The Tarim runs along the edge of the Taklamakan, where sand is easier to stabilize because of the transitional terrain. If a river cutting straight into the heart of the desert were chosen, the water would simply sink into deep sand layers, producing almost no effect. Put plainly, the Tarim was not the optimal choice. It was the only viable choice left. Starting in the year 2000, China officially launched the project. As mentioned earlier, the first thing that must be made clear is this. This is not mass tree planting just to make satellite maps look greener. It is also not large-scale flooding in the sense of pour in as much water as possible. In fact, China had already tried those approaches elsewhere and failed. Overwatering in a salty environment only causes plant roots to rot faster. Releasing water at the wrong time simply makes it evaporate more quickly. The method, therefore, began with a step that sounds very simple, but in reality is extremely risky. Cutting canals through the desert. A series of straight, long canals were dug parallel to the Tarim River. Some stretch 20 to 40 kilometers, others only a few kilometers, and from there they branch into hundreds of smaller channels. Seen from satellite imagery, the entire system looks like an artificial circulatory network. The main canals act as arteries, the branch canals as capillaries, and the smallest